Mental Math 5, more percentages. What do we already know? In the last Mental Math lesson, we learned how to calculate 1% of a number by moving the decimal 2 places to the left, 2% of a number by doubling 1%, 10% of a number by moving the decimal 1 place to the left, and 20% of a number by doubling 10%. So we're going to check out some problems and see what we remember. 1% of 450. So remember, to calculate 1% of a number, we move the decimal 2 places to the left. So 1% of 450 is 4.5. 2% of 450. So remember, to find 2% of a number, we just double 1%. So since 1% was 4.5, 2% would be 9. 10% of 450. So we move the decimal 1 place to the left. So 10% of 450 would be 45. And 20% of 450. So to find 20% of 450, we double 10%, which was 45. So 20% of 450 would be 90. So we're going to use that information to help us calculate other percentages. The first one we're going to look at is 5% of a number. To find 5% of a number, we need to recognize that 5 is half of 10. Therefore, in order to find 5% of a number, we start by finding 10% of that number and divide it by 2, or cut it in half. So 5% of a number is just half of 10%. So we'll try a few problems. 5% of 800 is 40. So if we find 10% of 800, we move the decimal 1 place to the left. 10% of 800 is 80. Half of 80 is 40. 5% of 60 is 3. So if we move the decimal 1 place to the left, 10% of 60 is 6, and we cut that in half to get 3. 5% of 82 is 4.1. So 10% of 82 would be 8.2. And if you struggle with cutting numbers like 8.2 in half, just think of it as 2 separate pieces. So half of 8 is 4, half of 2 is 1. So half of 8.2 is 4.1. 5% of 44 is 2.2. So 10% of 44 would be 4.4, and we cut 4.4 in half and we get 2.2. 5% of 4,000 is 200. 10% of 4,000 would be 400, and half of 400 is 200. The next percentages we are going to find are 3 or 4% of a number. So I've grouped these together because the skills are very similar. They're also very similar to finding 2% of a number that we did in the last lesson. We can find 3 or 4% of a number using the same strategy as we used to find 2% of a number. We start by finding 1% of that number and multiply it by 3 or 4. This can be a bit more challenging than finding 2% of a number. So if you find the numbers too difficult to deal with, consider estimating, which we will visit later in this lesson. So sometimes when we're trying to multiply by 3 or 4, more complex numbers are very difficult to deal with. We're going to see at the end of this lesson a way to estimate answers that we can't calculate precisely. But for now, we're going to be calculating 3% and 4% of a number. So we have to find 1% of that number and then multiply it by 3 or 4. So let's try a few. So 1% of 500, remember we move the decimal 2 places to the left, so 1% of 500 is 5. So we're going to use that information to first calculate 3% of 500. So if 1% of 500 is 5, all we have to do is multiply that by 3 to get 15. So 3% of 500 is 15. So what about 4% of 500? So if 1% of 500 is 5, we just multiply that by 4 to tell us that 4% of 500 is 20. 3% of 1200. So first you have to determine that 1% of 1200 would be 12 by moving that decimal 2 places to the left. So to find 3% of 1200, we would just do 12 times 3, which is 36. And 4% of 1200, so 1% of 1200 is 12, like we said above, and 12 times 4 would be 48. So 4% of 1200 is 48. Finding 50% of a number. Finding 50% of a number is very similar to finding 5% of a number. To find 50% of a number, we need to recognize that 50 is half of 100. Since 100% of a number is just that number, we must divide it by 2 in order to find 50%. So to find 50% of a number, all we have to do is divide it by 2 or cut it in half. So 50% of 800 would be 400. So we've just cut 800 in half. 50% of 60 would be 30. 50% of 82 would be 41. So again, if you struggle with numbers like 82, cutting them in half, cut 8 in half and cut 2 in half. 50% of 44 would be 22. And 50% of 4,000 would be 2,000. Next, we're going to find 30 or 40% of a number, which is again very similar to finding 3 and 4% of a number. We can find 30 or 40% of a number using the same strategy as we used to find 20% of a number. We start by finding 10% of that number and multiply it by 3 or 4. Another strategy could be to find 3 or 4% of that number and then multiply by 10. So we'll see both of those strategies. So if we're looking at the number 500, 10% of 500, we move the decimal 1 place to the left and it would be 50. So we can use that information to help us first find 30% of 500. So 30% of 500 is just 50 times 3, which would be 150. And 40% of 500 would be, it would just be 4 times 50, which is 10% of 500, and that's 200. So let's use the other strategy where we find 3 or 4% and then multiply by 10. So for example, 30% of 1200. So we saw in the last, or in the 3 and 4% lesson, or section of the lesson, that 3% of 1200 was 36. We multiply that by 10 and we know that 30% of 1200 would be 360. 40% of 1200, well, we know from the section of the lesson where we did 3 and 4% that 4% of 1200 was 48. We multiply that by 10. 40% of 1200 is 480. So either of those strategies, whether you find 10% and then multiply by 3 or 4, or you find 3 or 4% and then multiply by 10, will work perfectly fine. The last thing we're going to look at today is estimating percentages. So like I said earlier in the lesson, sometimes when you're multiplying by things like 3 or 4, more complicated numbers are very difficult to work with. So when we're dealing with a complicated number, something a little bit more complex and not as easy to multiply, we can estimate an answer. So we're not going to get the exact answer in this case, but we're going to get a good estimate. Sometimes when trying to determine percentages of a number, the multiplication can be difficult. In this case, we can estimate our solution by rounding to an easier number. So let's check out an example. So 3% of 189. So we start by determining 1% of 189 by moving the decimal 2 places to the left, and we get 1.89. So if we then want to determine 3%, we would have to do 1.89 times 3. That is not an easy problem to solve. So instead, we say that 1.89 is very close to 2. So we consider, instead of 1.89 times 3, we consider 2 times 3. So we're rounding that decimal to the nearest whole number. And we know that 2 times 3 is 6. So we don't know the exact value of 3% of 189, but we know that 3% of 189 is approximately 6. So it's not an exact answer, but it's an approximate answer, which is usually acceptable when we're dealing with mental math. So now go online and try the Mental Math 5 quiz on the website and see how you do.